Gibney, thank you very much for doing this. So for all the years that Benjamin Netanyahu has been in the American media, I think there's very little sense in the U.S. about his domestic troubles in Israel. We keep hearing he's been charged, and the President of the United States keeps saying he needs to be pardoned. You've made this documentary that explains what is at the core of this controversy. Like, what are the charges? What is he accused of doing? Did he do it? So I'm going to stand back and just let you, if you would, outline what Benjamin Netanyahu has been accused of doing.
Well, roughly speaking, you'd say it was bribery, or you'd say it was corruption. I mean, and I can detail the charges. This is a film that I produced, and it was directed by Alexis Bloom. And back in 2023, I got a strange message on Signal from somebody who said that they had all of the police interrogation videos from the Benjamin Netanyahu investigation. And they had been investigating Netanyahu since 2016 for charges of corruption. That is to say, trading on his position as prime minister to get money in all sorts of favors, jewelry for his wife, very expensive Cuban cigars, hundreds of millions of dollars in forgiveness of certain loans in order to be able to get favorable coverage on a news website called Walla. So it was a pretty interesting case, and it went from the very small, meaning very expensive Cuban cigars from a rather famous movie producer named Arnon Milchan, to something very big, which is effectively a $250 million financial arrangement in exchange for coverage, good coverage for Netanyahu. So it was a pretty big deal.
What did so you got the tapes? Let me just ask, to the extent you can say, where did they come from?
I can't say where they came from. I can't say anything about the source, but what I can say is we got over 1,000 hours of tapes. And these were interviews with Netanyahu himself by the police, also Netanyahu's wife, Sarah, his son, Yair, also with a number of key people close to Netanyahu. For example, Nir Hefetz, his former head of communications, Sheldon Adelson, who we know in this country as a billionaire, now deceased, his wife, Miriam Adelson, Arnon Milchan, a famous Israeli businessman, arms dealer, who also became a very famous motion picture producer. So it was a kind of an extraordinary array of evidence. And while some of this evidence had been published in Israel in written form, nobody had seen the tapes. And the tapes are very revealing, particularly for Netanyahu, because Netanyahu tries to cultivate this image of the grand vizier, the great statesman of Israel. Here you see a rather petty, corrupt man desperately lying to save his skin. And his wife, who is a deeply entitled woman, trying to claim that, so what if we got stuff? I mean, we deserve it because we're doing so much for the nation and for the world. And his son, Yair, who is also extremely entitled, screaming at the police, yelling, you're like the Stasi. So it was an illuminating look at the actual character behind the facade, sort of like that moment in The Wizard of Oz where, Toto pulls back the curtain and the wizard says, please pay no attention. But it was really revealing.
If you can, and I think people watching this will watch the film, but I'm interested in your take, having watched 1,000 hours of this. What is it? Can you go more deeply into what do you think it reveals about the prime minister and his character?
Well, I think it reveals, a kind of deep-seated corruption, a willingness to do almost anything to save his skin. I think that he became possessed after the election in 2015 of a sense of enormous arrogance, that he was now the man, because he came back from what seemed to be a defeat to an enormous victory. And now he had this sense of entitlement. Interestingly, then he began to cash in on that entitlement, and he was caught. But what happened then was that rather, as he heard the sound of the possibility of the jail door slamming shut on him, he began to start to do things that really took Israel in a very dark direction. The first thing he tried to do was to essentially fix the Department of Justice. He tried to engage in a series of this is before October 7th. He tried to engage in a series of reforms of the judicial system, which would weaken the power of the judiciary in Israel. Most likely because that would undermine the case against him. That's the most direct likely outcome. But the other thing was that by this time he had formed a government with an extremely right-wing coalition with a guy named Ben-Gvir, who is head of national security, and a guy named Smotrich, who's is a head of the of finance. They are extremely right-wing, extremely anti-Palestinian, and their designs were to expand illegal settlements in the West Bank. And in some cases, well, it was already a dire situation for Palestinians on the West Bank. Nevertheless, there would be judicial orders which would sometimes get in the way of that. That was another aspect of this. Well, when Netanyahu tried to fix the judiciary, the country rose up, and it was in a huge uproar over these changes, which were fundamentally undermining Israel's democracy. Not too long after, of course, there was the terrible attack by Hamas on October 7th, which shocked Israel. What people began to learn was that for years, Netanyahu, again, I think as part of the way he sees the world and as part of a kind of more generalized sense of corruption, had been trying to modulate the relationship with Hamas, and indeed had been allowing millions and millions of dollars to flow to Hamas from Qatar, sometimes in bags of cash traveling through Israel. And the reason he was doing that was to undermine the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank in order to be able to allow for his right-wing coalition to get more and more territory via settlements. So all sorts of strange, corrupt deals were happening. But then I think that post 10/7, which was a terrible moment, I don't want to minimize it in any way. It was a horrific attack, and we show some of that attack in the film. But he then launched an attack on Gaza, which was so beyond any sense of proportionality. Now we have at least over 75,000 people dead. Of course, now we have an Iran war and a Lebanon war and so forth and so on. But one of the goals, I'm convinced, and not me, but all of the witnesses who are, very reputable members of the security establishment in Israel in the film, indicate that part of the enduring ferocity, savagery of the war was due to becoming a wartime president who could then not be prosecuted or successfully prosecuted for the crimes he had committed. The trial, not only the investigation, but now there's been a trial. The trial is still ongoing. This is 10 years after the investigation started. So long as he's the commander in chief and he's waging war, how dare you attack the president? So in a way, this kind of venal personal corruption that starts with cigars and pink champagne, for which they had code names, and then evolves into corrupt deals relating to the media, becomes a mechanism by which slowly but surely the corruption got greater and greater and greater until it became a moral corruption in which the world is now engulfed.